It is certainly a blessing to be able to share God's Word with all of you today. And I hope the statements that Mel made really resonate in your hearts, because we're living in some tough times. We're living in times where if you stand for what is right, someone is going to call you a hater. If you say what is not acceptable in public, you're going to be called a bigot. God's people are going to be tested, and tested severely. That's why it's so important for us to understand where our strengths lie. Our strengths are in unity. Our strengths are in knowledge. Our strengths are in understanding the statements that are made in the Bible so that we can apply them properly. You know, years ago, when we had a rebellion among women, and the feminist movement began, I understood it. I understood why. Because there was a hypocrisy that pervaded this land that I knew was going to cause that kind of an uproar. And it did. And it had the effect that I was afraid it was going to have. We live in a pendulum world, if you don't know that. A pendulum world where when something swings too far this way and everyone realizes, whoa, this is out of control, we grab that pendulum and we yank back on it, and it comes back and it goes this way, way out of control. And we live in this constant vacillation back and forth instead of establishing a truth and sticking with it. There's a good reason why I knew that rebellion was coming. You know, you watch television of shows years and years ago, how the mom worked all day, the dad worked all day, they got home and the kids did whatever they wanted to do. And Dad sat down in his chair and propped his feet up, and Mom kept working until it was midnight. Something's wrong with that picture. Yeah. Something is seriously wrong when there's not equality. Now, when I say equality, I don't mean the same role. I mean equality. I mean, people are equal. Their value is equal. But you didn't see that. You didn't see that in those years gone by. And because of that, I knew that there was going to be an uprising, because you just can't have that without an uprising. There are a lot of things that are that way. When I grew up in the church, you couldn't have a deck of cards. You could not carry a deck of cards because that was sinful. You couldn't even think about going to the movies. You went to a dance, you were labeled. I didn't go to dance. I went out in the car behind the dance. And I'll tell you what, I'd have been a lot safer in the dance than I was in the car. Or maybe it wasn't me that was safer, but there was rules that I didn't understand that just didn't make any sense to me. For instance, you couldn't dance, but you could go to the skating rink and do exactly the same thing, and that was fine. Because that was roller skating. We've got all kinds of rules. we've got rules that people look at, and they look at them from a distance and they say, where is that in the Bible? And I agree with them. Where is that in the Bible? We come up with these laws, these rules that actually run people away. Instead of embracing people and bringing them in, that doesn't mean we bring in and excuse sin. It means that we speak where the Bible speaks like we've always said we do. Speak where the Bible speaks and be silent where it's silent. That's what I believe we ought to do. Amen. But let's be careful what we establish as law. Because you know what Jesus said more often than He did anything else to the most religious people of His day? If it wasn't you brood of vipers, He said, you have heard that it was said, this is what you were told, but I say to you, I'm going to tell you what it really was. And it very seldom ever fit what they believed and what they were practicing at the time. I want us to go back to Isaiah where Russ read, and I really appreciate Russ's reading. I want to look at a number of the things that are contained in this. There are a lot of woes in this, and I don't want to get hung up on beating the death out of people, but I want us to pay attention to some things here. It says, woe to those who add house to house and join field to field. He's talking about the greed that pervades society at times. He's talking in Isaiah chapter 5, verse 8, When you look at what Isaiah is saying here, this whole nation was wrapped up in making money. And when the economy got bad, boy, I'll tell you what, somebody's going to lose. And it's not going to be the rich and the wealthy. He says, those who add house to house and join field to field until there's no room, so that you live alone in the midst of the land. Money is only worth so much. You know, they had a beautiful law. They had a beautiful system. Under the law of Moses, you know, your family was given land when they went into the land. When they took the land of Canaan, it was parceled out to every tribe and every family, and every person had an inheritance. And they took care of each other. That's one of the reasons why the Jewish people have always been successful. Wherever they are on the face of this earth, they have been successful. Matter of fact, so successful, they've been run out of most countries that they've been in because of that success. But that's other people's fault, not theirs. They take care of their own. As a matter of fact, you know, when a person got poor, we were talking about them selling their children. We read that in class this morning, that this woman was afraid she was going to have to sell her children as slaves in order to pay her debts. Well, that was a legal thing under the law. You could do that. But guess what? It wasn't the same kind of slavery. You call it the same word, but it's not the same kind of thing, because when they were sold, they had to be treated fairly. They had to be treated right. When they had finished their payment, they had to be released, and when they were released, they couldn't be released with nothing. They were given enough to get a new start with. And in addition to that, if their property had to be sold for some reason, at the end of what was called the year of Jubilee, all that property went back to the original owners. So, buyer beware. If you buy property and it's close to the year of Jubilee, you better know that you've only got 6 years left to own this property, because it's going back to the original owners. That was a good system. And a slave could only be held until the year of Jubilee, and then they had to be set free. And when they were set free with a new start, enough money to get started again. They weren't in that same pauper condition they were when they went into it. So as a result, when they followed God's law, there were very few people who were destitute among God's people. Except when they started doing stuff like this. Except when greed took over. They had laws They had laws about gleaning, and I'm glad to hear that it still exists. That is, that they could not cut or harvest the corners of their fields. That was left for the poor people. We enjoyed that in Washington when we were there, because we had a farmer that lived nearby, and he had 9,000 irrigated acres of potatoes. That's a lot of spuds, let me tell you. And he left all of the corners, and he had these big diggers that would come in, and he would dig up those corners, and he'd go over and he'd pile all those potatoes up in one place, and people could come and just dig all the potatoes they wanted. Man, oh man, we fed our hogs potatoes, and they got skinnier and skinnier. I thought my hogs were going to die on free potatoes. Then I talked to the vet about it, and he said, well, are you cooking them? I said, no. He said, well, they don't like raw potatoes. They can't even digest them. I started cooking those potatoes, and they swelled up like they were filled with air. Man, it pays to know what you're doing. It pays to know God's laws. It pays to understand why God said some of the things that He said, because, I had the idea as a kid that God made all these rules just to keep me from having fun. That was my view. That's how I grew up. That's what I understood until I was about 22 years old. I went and had my fun, if you can call it that. I'm still trying to figure out how having your face buried in a turlet is fun. That's not fun. But somehow I was convinced that that was fun. That's not fun. That's degrading. That's disgusting. That's everything that is being talked about here, that Isaiah says, woe to those who have this as their goal in life. If you have that goal in life, you need to get a life. Because that's going to be destructive, and it's going to affect the rest of your life when you finally realize this is not all that smart. Isaiah goes on. Here's what he says. He says in verse 11, woe to those who rise early in the morning that they may pursue strong drink. You remember back in Acts chapter 1, chapter 2, where they had been speaking in tongues? And it caused a stir in town. Everybody saying, whoa, what in the world is going on? And some knucklehead in the crowd said, they're drunk. Peter stands up and he says, we're not drunk. It's only the third hour of the day. But believe it or not, there are some people who are by that time of the day already pursuing that habit because they are controlled by it. He says, woe to those who rise early in the morning that they may pursue strong drink, who stay up late in the evening that wine may inflame them. For too long, that's the goal of too many. To be numbed from the effects of life. To not face life. To go ahead and numb yourself up to where you don't have to worry about anything that's happening. The only problem with that is that when you wake up, when you sober up, it's there just like it was, only worse. Only worse than it was before. It never gets any better when this is the life that you're pursuing. And he goes on, he says, they stay up late in the evening that wine may inflame them, and their banquets are accompanied by lyre and harp, by tambourine and flute, and by wine. They've got all of this entertainment, all of this stuff to keep their minds busy. But they pay no attention to the deeds of the Lord. Don't want to be bothered by what God has to say about anything. let alone the admonition that, oh, that's not good for you. You shouldn't keep doing that because that's not good for you. And we continue, and then we pay the price. And then quite often, we get mad and we blame God because we didn't listen in the first place. Now you tell me the logic in that. You tell me how smart that really is for human beings who have such great intellect to know that there are rules here that are made to protect us, made to help us get through life unharmed, and we ignore them, and then we get mad at God. And I hear it all the time. I hear that all the time from people who have violated this book of laws. And you know, really, when you get right down to it, this is, now don't stone me when I say this is a book of suggestions. Because I don't know of anybody that God takes by the neck, by the throat, and makes do any of these things. In that sense, He is suggesting what's best for us, and we can either listen or we can ignore. The problem is, when we ignore, we usually ignore out of ignorance. Let me ask you a question. Be honest now. Are you ignorant? Come on now. I don't see any hands. If you're not ignorant, you better be ready for my next question. Because I got a lot of things I want to know. And if you know it all, I got some serious questions for you. You know, the problem is that all of us are ignorant. Just in different things. I mean, you take the most brilliant scientist there is in the world, sometimes he can't find his socks. I can tell you that because I lived with one for a while. Some of the most brilliant people in the world are so ignorant in other things. Here's the thing. As you read what Isaiah says here, he says, nor do they consider the work of God's hands. Therefore, my people go into exile. The reason God's people right here that Isaiah was preaching to, the reason they were going into exile, because they didn't know, because they were ignorant. Hosea said, my people are destroyed for a lack of knowledge. The whole world is ignorant about what God thinks about just about everything. That's why I want us to change the way we evangelize. I don't want us to go out and tell people to come to us because we've got the truth. I want us to convince people to come search for the truth with us. Because I know that I'm still wrong in things. I want everybody's help in finding where we're right and where we're wrong. I want us all together to be on a path searching for God's truth. If you already think you've got it all, don't bother coming. We don't need that. We need people who know that we can be wrong, that we have been wrong, that we want to be right. Amen. And we need to let people know that we're not dictating, we're searching. Come join the search party, searching for the truth. Isaiah goes on. Here's what is so hard about today. Go down to verse 18 with me. We're going to talk about some of these other things later, but right now let's go to verse 18. He says, woe to those who drag iniquity with the cords of falsehood. Adam and Eve had something they wanted. Eve especially. Women. Yeah. This woman had something she wanted. It looked so good. She wanted it real bad. All it took was someone, didn't matter how valid their arguments were, someone to come along to give her a suggestion that explained away the argument not to. Did God say that you would surely die? Yeah. No, you're not. Now let me ask you, why should she have listened to him? Why? What had he ever done for them? What great thing had Satan ever done, the serpent ever done, to gain their trust that they would trust him over what God had said? Here's the thing. She didn't want to know that. She wanted what she wanted. That's usually what gets us all into trouble, is we want what we want and we don't care about what the truth is. Now, he says, woe to those who do that, who say, let's go down to verse 20. Woe to those who call evil good and good evil, who substitute darkness for light and light for darkness, who substitute bitter for sweet and sweet for bitter. Woe to those, excuse me, who are wise in their own eyes and clever in their own thought. Woe to those who are heroes in drinking wine and valiant men in mixing strong drink, who justify the wicked for a bribe and take away the rights of the ones who are in the right. You know, when I started noticing, really noticing how Satan works in our world, way back when Ann and I were first married, I used to like these situation comedies. And I noticed something about those things. Every time one of them would come on, the situation was somebody doing something that was sinful, that I shouldn't be approving of in the first place. And then the whole comedy was making that sinful thing funny. And then the solution to that was not to fix it, not to do it right, but to lie about it. And everything in that show, and I started looking at every one of them were the same. They would take something evil and they would make it funny, and they would answer the truth by lying about it. And that's what everybody found so hilarious. And I started thinking, you know, the devil can make anything acceptable if he gets us to laugh about it at first. Because you can't be angry about something you're laughing about. You can't rise up in righteous indignation if you're just hilariously giggling over something. That's his first tool to get us to set aside God's Word and God's truth, is by making it funny. Oh, that is so hilarious. And we still have the same thing going on today. And everything that would have been an abomination in the eyes of just about anybody years ago is acceptable now because we first made it funny. It's not funny. It's not funny when people lose their souls over things. I told you, I'm out of time, but I want to share one little story with you. The Supreme Court decision that was just made about changing the status of marriage, something that's been 10,000 years. Now it's okay for women to get married to each other or men to get married to each other. I've got a question for you. What is it that makes anything right or wrong? Is it a panel of judges that decide? Or is there a creator who made things and rules by which everything is supposed to operate? who are we going to answer to? The Supreme Court? Or are we going to answer to our Maker? My daughter Candy and I worked as millwrights, carpenter millwrights. We had a foreman. The foreman was a young woman. I didn't like her when I first met her. And I have to admit, the reason I didn't like her was because she was a lesbian. I didn't like her because she was always talking about her wife. I knew what my wife was. I came to love that young woman. I came to love her like one of my own children. I didn't excuse any of her lifestyle. But I didn't hate her because of the way she lived. I did everything in my power I could to convince her that that lifestyle was destructive. I did everything in my power to speak the truth to her in love, so that she understood I'm not a hater unless it's hating the act, the sin that will eventually cost her her soul. She's still one of my favorite people. But I got to tell you, I've got favorite people who used to be bank robbers. I got favorite people who used to be pipe bombers. Now you might say, oh, right. Ask those two women there, they'll verify. You'll trust their word, not mine. I've got favorite people who used to be the worst drunks on the planet. But I love them. I hated their actions. That's what we need to do, and we need to educate people on why God's rules are here. Why they're the best course of action. Why we need to pay attention to them, because there is therefore before us both a blessing and a curse. The blessing is if we listen to what God says, and a curse if we do not. It's just that simple. We can deny it if we want to, but you can deny gravity. Try jumping off of this building. Gravity works. I don't care whether you recognize it or not. Laws of God are laws of God. And I don't have the power to change them. We're out of time. I hope that if you've heard the gospel and you know what you need to do to make your life right before God, don't waste this opportunity. Make your life right this morning. Come as we stand and sing the invitation song that we have announced.